My name is Mark Otto. I'm President and Executive Director of the United War Veterans Council, producers of today's event. Welcome and thank you for joining us for They Turn the Tide, our annual Battle of the Atlantic commemoration. At this event, we honor those who gave their lives in this vital World War II campaign. We also celebrate the bonds of friendship and alliance between freedom-loving nations then and now. As part of our ceremonial opening, I direct your attention behind you to a special guest, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Warren D'Amford, named for a World War II hero whose name is inscribed on this memorial. Thank you to the crew of the D'Amford for joining us and for getting us started here today. We'll learn more about the ship and her legacy during this evening's ceremony. I now turn things over to our Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Ryan Haig, Head of Legacy and Education for the United War Veterans Council.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And now, please rise if you are able for the presentation of the colors of the United States and a performance of the U.S. National Anthem. Present the colors.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. Thank you to our color guard from the 6th Communication Battalion, U.S. Marine Corps, and to Flotilla Staff Officer Louis DeLeo of the Coast Guard Auxiliary for that stirring rendition of America's national anthem. And welcome to They Turn the Tide, presented by the United War Veterans Council in association with the American Battle Monuments Commission and with the support of Wounded Warrior Project. As you just heard, this event is produced by the United War Veterans Council. Many of you know the UWVC as the producer of the New York City Veterans Day Parade each November. We have with us today military and veteran representatives from each of the U.S. military service branches that participated in the Battle of the Atlantic. We also welcome guests from the allied nation that fought alongside us in that battle in alphabetical order: Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, and of course, the United Kingdom. We also welcome a senior representative from the American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC, stewards of this memorial, and dozens of U.S. military cemeteries and monuments around the globe. This year's commemoration marks ABMC's 100th anniversary. It is also the 80th anniversary of the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic and the 60th anniversary of the dedication of this memorial by President John F. Kennedy. We are honored to have the opportunity to mark this special occasion. And now, to get things started, please welcome Master Chief Vincent W. Patton III, 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, retired. Master Chief Patton also served as Grand Marshal last year's New York City Veterans Day Parade, and we're always happy to have him back. Vince?
Thank you. And good evening, everybody. It is such a pleasure that each and every one of you are here. To all honored guests, and as far as I'm concerned, every one of you are honored guests, and particularly to our crew out there, the Coast Guard Cutter Warren Danforth. You're the greatest. World War II in Europe began in 1939. By late 1941, the Nazi war machine had conquered much of the continent. Great Britain and the Soviet Union remained defiant, along with the forces in exile and resistant movements of the occupied nations. Although not only neutral, the United States was the arsenal of democracy, providing supplies and equipment to the beleaguered allies. But this support had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which was ruled by the Nazi submarines. When the United States entered the war in late 1941, dozens of ships were being sunk every month. The Allies were losing the war at sea. But with British and Commonwealth forces from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, along with the free forces of Belgium, France, Netherlands, Norway, and Poland, as well as Brazil in the southern Atlantic, our sailors, Coast Guards, airmen, and merchant mariners fought back. The dangerous crossings between the United States and European seaports were costly, where thousands died. Many were troops who had yet to get into the fight. The defense of these convoys was meticulous, strategic, and of course, with a lot of faith. The combined Allied forces defeated the Nazi submarine menace and made it possible for the United States to project its military might across the ocean. They made it possible the liberation of Europe. They turned the tide so that the forces of democracy could win the war. This is why we honor these brave and gallant service members. This is why we must never forget the true meaning of the ultimate sacrifice, that our service members are placed in harm's way, and through their teamwork and understanding of the preservation of democracy. This is why we are here. We must never forget the bravery and courage for all who fought for this country. Today, we honor these individuals with sincerity and reverence. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. We're gathered here today specifically because today, or more precisely tomorrow, is the anniversary of the date that the Nazi submarine commander, Admiral Donitz, pulled the Wolfpacks out of the Atlantic. The war and the campaign continued through 1945, but that was the moment. That was the moment. From that point on, Germany was losing the war in the Atlantic. Now, as you know, we have a special guest with us here today, the Coast Guard cutter Danforth, and we'll hopefully see them back at the end of the ceremony. The Danforth is named for Warren Danforth, an African-American Coast Guard hero whose name is inscribed on these memorial walls. And to learn more about Warren Danforth's legacy and about the vessel that bears his name, we have with us Rear Admiral John W. Mauger, Commander, 1st Coast Guard District. Admiral Mauger?
Thank you, Ryan. Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly a special evening here in New York as we stand here at the Battery at the foot of Manhattan, overlooking the Statue of Liberty, New York Harbor, and the entrance out through Verrazano Narrows, the gateway to the Atlantic, to remember all of those who came before us, who were so instrumental in turning the tide and advancing democracy around the world during World War II. And so tonight we're here not only to honor all of those, but to call special attention to Coast Guardsman Warren Danforth. the namesake of the fast response cutter that's offshore there. So Warren grew up in a small town in Alabama, Alabama, and he entered the Coast Guard as a steward. That was the only rate that was open to African Americans at that time. But he also volunteered, as others had done, to serve as a rescue swimmer on board the cutter. And so he served during the war effort on board the Coast Guard cutter Escanaba, which was a 165-foot cutter that was enlisted in the help to run convoy missions and run search and rescue for the troops that were going overseas, leaving the Northeast here out of New York and Boston. And if you look at Warren D'Ampert, the ship that's out there, she's 154 feet long and with a crew of 24 on board. But back in the day, the Escanaba was 165 feet, so not much bigger than the ship that sails out there, with a crew of 105 on board, including Warren D'Ampert. And so they sailed in February of 1943 as part of the escort for the Dorchester. The Dorchester was a troop ship that was carrying almost 1,000 soldiers over to Greenland. And unfortunately, in early February of 1943, the Dorchester was torpedoed by a German U-boat, putting all 1,000 people on board at risk. The Escanaba had just piloted this new idea that the XO on board had to put the rescue swimmers into wetsuits and put them into the water and have them carry lines to tie off to any survivors that were out there. Because in early February 1943, in the North Atlantic, the water temperature was about 35 degrees. The air temperature was about 34 degrees. And at nighttime, with the waves and everything involved, it was a very dangerous mission for those crew members to do, and many folks lost the ability to swim and succumbed just to the cold at that time. So Warren D'Ampert put on the wetsuit, entered the water, and over the course of about 6 hours, rescued 100 crew members off of the Dorchester, 100 soldiers that came back to their families. Now, the Dorchester was the largest single loss of life for any single incident that happened there in the North Atlantic during World War II. But Warren D'Ampert and the crew of Escanaba were instrumental in saving over 200 of those soldiers. Unfortunately, 4 months later, coming up here just 80 years ago this coming June, Warren D'Ampert and the crew of the Escanaba were subsequently attacked in the North Atlantic, and all but 2 crew members from the Escanaba were lost, including Warren D'Ampert. And so for his service and for his heroism that night in February 1943, Warren D'Ampert was posthumously awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. And recognized among the other crew members of the Escanaba for their heroism and their bravery in saving so many. As Master Chief Patton pointed out, this was a turning point in the war. In February and March of 1943, 82 Allied ships were lost for only 12 U-boats that were sunk. So it was a really dark time for these crew members to take to those waters. But that war effort quickly turned around, and it's so wonderful to be here tonight to mark that occasion and remember all those that came before us. And so thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening to remember the crews. And I encourage you to get up to the Intrepid Pier or get over to Staten Island to meet the crew of Warren D'Ampert that are serving our nation so bravely today. Thank you very much, and Semper Paratus.
Thank you, Rear Admiral Mauger, for joining us and for sharing the story of the D'Ampert. Next, here to tell us more about this magnificent yet poignant memorial at which we have gathered, please welcome a special guest from the American Battle Monuments Commission, Commissioner Raymond Kemp. Sir?
Good evening. Let me help you. I say good evening, you say good evening back. Good evening. Yeah, realize we are here to commemorate an awesome moment in our Navy, and our nation's history. Though some may consider it solemn, I think it is awesome to consider those who have gone before us, to consider Warren DeAmber. By the way, his name is on that second panel over your left shoulder in case you're wanting to go over and take a look at the center one, about shoulder length up for me anyway. The opportunity to celebrate those who went before us, the opportunity to celebrate those folks who had that honor, that courage, commitment, the integrity, character, the strength of code, personal code, to go out and do those things that were hard. Hearing that story, Admiral, I appreciate that. I did a little background research. I did some studying, but it's just different to hear a fellow Coast Guardsman tell that story, so I appreciate that. What I also know is I'm a Fleet Week veteran. I did 2 Fleet Weeks on USS Kearsarge. Absolutely love coming to New York. No greater people in this nation when it comes down to treating sailors right. And I tell you that because I've been around just a little bit. 33 years on active duty. I retired as the Fleet Master Chief of Navy Europe, Navy Africa. I truly had the honor to serve during some incredible times, and I'm very glad to be here with you today to recognize those who have gone before us. It was Churchill who said the only thing that he was truly afraid of during that time frame was the U-boats. And I happen to be a guided missile destroyer sailor. I know the DE-529, which, by the way, happened to be the first all-black ship in the Navy, a combatant ship in the Navy, was very instrumental in ridding our waters of those U-boats. I happen to know that Vince Patton, who went before us, wasn't mentioned, but he happened to be the first and only black Master Chief of the Coast Guard. He's here with us today. Again, someone who maintains a high level of courage and intentionality in his service. And so we're not just here to hear some cool speeches and have some wreaths brought out. We're here truly to celebrate. So I hope with your mind you gaze into the past and think about those folks who stood with that high level of courage and realize that we too have the opportunity to do that. For those who are in uniform, for sure, we have that expectation. And for those of us who have taken the uniform off, or you support our nation's military members in whatever way that may be, we still have the opportunity to stand with intentionality and be proud of who we are and those who stand with us. On behalf of the American Battle Monuments Commission, I welcome you to the East Coast Memorial. This memorial honors Americans lost in the Atlantic waters during World War II. It's a great privilege, an honor to participate in this annual commemoration kicking off Fleet Week. I thank the United War Veterans Council for their continuing work in organizing this annual Fleet Week remembrance, and I want to acknowledge the work of the folks from Parks and Rec, by the way, who are partners here in New York and partner with ABMC, the American Battle Monuments Commission, in the caretaking of these grounds. The American Battle Monuments Commission is the guardian of America's military cemeteries and memorials around the world. We work daily to honor the achievements and sacrifices of the United States Armed Forces. We do so at 26 overseas military cemeteries and 32 memorials worldwide. 60 years ago, on May 23rd, President Kennedy stood on these grounds to dedicate this memorial, honoring 4,600 fallen, whose names are inscribed on these 8 granite pylons. On the base of the eagle, here behind me, the sculpture, you'll read these words: "Erected by the United States of America in proud and grateful remembrance of her sons who gave their lives in her service and who sleep in the American coastal waters of the Atlantic. Into thy hands, O Lord." 28 years later, in November of 1991, an inscription was added, recognizing the 6,185 merchant mariners and 529 members of the U.S. Army Transport Service who lost their lives in the high seas during the Second World War. This is our commission's centennial year, by the way. For 100 years, the American Battle Monuments Commission has had the privilege, the honor of commemorating the service and sacrifices of American forces. We do so on behalf of the American people who entrusted our agency their perpetual care of her fallen, interred and memorialized overseas, and the missing listed by name on 3 memorials here in our United States. But we remember too those who fought at their side, many returning home with life-altering injuries or psychological scars, with memories that may have haunted them for the rest of their lives. We remember the families, the fallen left behind, their mothers, fathers, their sisters, wives, and children. The panic built at that knock at the door, signaling the delivery of a telegram, informing them of their loved one's death. The pain of that loss that changed their lives forever. For 100 years, the men and women of our commission have ensured that the memory of those who fell defending our nation will never fade. At the start of a new century, for this noble mission, we renew our nation's promise in the words of our first chairman, which was General of Armies John J. Pershing. The time will not dim the glory of their deeds. Our mission is timeless, as are the words spoken by President Kennedy 60 years ago when he dedicated this memorial. There is no final victory, he said, but rather all Americans must always be prepared and play their proper part in a difficult and dangerous world. And I believe it was Kipling who said, "We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to do violence on those who would harm us." In 6 days, our nation will pause and reflect on those who have given their lives for our freedom and the freedom of others. This Memorial Day, remember those who shoulder that mission today. We do live in a dangerous world. There is no final victory. May God bless all who have served, those who sacrifice all, and those who carry the torch of freedom today. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We continue with the story of another name from these walls. The organization that began World War II as the U.S. Army Air Corps evolved into the U.S. Army Air Forces before becoming our modern independent U.S. Air Force just after the war. Stepping in for Senior Master Sergeant Andrea Cox will be Captain Allie Delury, United States Air Force.
Joseph Rocco Curl was born on June 26, 1922 in Syracuse, New York. He was the second of 7 children born to Tony and Concetta Curl, who were both immigrants from Italy. Joseph grew up into a tall young man with brown eyes and dark hair. By 1942, he was married and working at the Holcomb Steel Company in Syracuse, New York. On October 6th of that year, he enlisted in the Army and was accepted into the Army Air Corps, even though he was missing the tip of his middle finger. Joseph rose to the rank of sergeant and was assigned as a gunner on a B-24J Liberator bomber nicknamed Foolish Dog. On June 30th, 1944, the Foolish Dog took off from Goose Bay in Newfoundland, Canada, bound for Iceland, but it never arrived. Over 30 aircraft took part in the search for the Foolish Dog and its crew, but nothing was ever found. Joseph and his 9 crewmates were officially declared missing in action. They are all remembered here at the East Coast Memorial, along with nearly 900 fellow airmen who lost their lives on and above the waters of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Captain Delury. The service and sacrifice of men like Joseph Curl made possible the liberation of the occupied countries of Europe. Here to speak on behalf of these nations, please welcome our friend, the Honorable Damien Labin, Deputy Consul General of France in New York. Monsieur?
Dear friends, dear allied nations, dear friends of democracy, it is an honor to be here today to commemorate the tens of thousands of Americans, British, and allied servicemen who lost their lives in the waters of the Atlantic during the Battle of the same name. The sacrifice that these sailors and airmen made has gotten less attention than the men and women who served in other World War II battles like D-Day, but their actions were just as crucial to the success of the Allied powers. Their efforts
helped Great Britain and the Soviet Union to withstand the Nazi assaults and build up US forces in Europe, making possible major offensives like D-Day, Operation Dragoon, and the invasion of Italy. They truly turned the tide of the war. And even though our countries were under enemy occupation, my European colleagues and I can be proud that France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and Poland also made military contribution to the vital effort. Same as, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. On behalf of the Allied powers and the liberated nations of Europe, I wish to express our deep, undying gratitude for the sacrifice that service members who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic made on our behalf. You liberated the continent from Nazism. You saved millions of lives. You saved our values, and you saved our independence. To the American Battle Monument Commission, stewards of this memorial, and of over 2,000 cemeteries and memorials in France, I salute you on your 100th anniversary. France will never forget the Americans who fought and died for her freedom in the two world wars, wherever they rest. Today, as you know, democracy is again in grave danger on the European continent. The determination in which freedom-loving nations stood for their values and their independence 80 years ago remain just as important today as it was then. Once again, we stand together. Here in New York, we also stand together behind our veterans and military families. The Consulate of France is proud to be part of the United War Veterans Council's efforts to build a stronger and more connected international community of friends and allies. Today's event is an extension of those efforts, and we look forward to continuing this important work with all of you. Once again, let me thank the United World Veterans Council for organizing this event and all the veterans here today to whom we owe our freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur Levin. The Deputy Consul General's words highlight our shared experiences in World War II, and at the same time, he reminds us that these relationships and friendships have endured over the years. Earlier this spring, the French consulate here hosted the initial meeting of Shoulder to Shoulder, a new UWVC initiative dedicated to bringing together our international allies. Many of today's attendees were at that meeting, where we laid the foundation for building a stronger international New York City veteran and military family community. We look forward to continuing this work and expanding the circle of participants in this effort, and we invite all of you here today to join us. In a moment, we're going to continue with another story from these walls, read by Ms. Nancy Shaliro, Senior Community Liaison, Wounded Warrior Project, and a Marine Corps veteran of Iraq. Nancy, why don't you come over here?
Thank you and good evening. The lives of David Malin Kerwin and Richard Paul Van Hook began on opposite sides of the country, but they would end together in the Caribbean far, far from home. David was born in Los Angeles in October of 1916 and grew up in California. He was an avid basketball player and played guard on his college team. Richard was born 4 years later and raised in Germantown, Pennsylvania, one of 4 sons born to Warren and May Van Hook. David joined the Marine Corps in May of 1941 before the United States entered the war. After aviation training in Jacksonville, Florida and Corpus Christi, Texas, he shipped out aboard the USS Murak as a second lieutenant. David arrived in the United States Marine Corps Air Station St. Thomas, Virgin Islands in early July 1942. There he met Private Richard Van Hook for the first time. Richard had arrived a few weeks earlier, arriving from Norfolk, Virginia, aboard the USS Joseph Dykman. He had been in the Marines for about 5 months. David and Richard were assigned to Marine Scouting Squadron 3 and flew in the same Vought OS-2 Kingfisher. David was a pilot and Richard was the radio operator and gunner. Together they began learning to fly anti-submarine patrols and other missions. On July 28, 1942, David and Richard took off after dark for night formation practice. Night flying in the 1940s was extremely difficult and dangerous, especially for inexperienced aircraft. About a half hour after midnight, contact with the aircraft was lost. The location of the downed plane was discovered after a wide-ranging search, but it was not possible to recover their remains. They were listed as killed in action, buried at sea. David and Richard are two of the only 7 Marines memorialized on the East Coast Memorial. Although they served on the far side of the world, from Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other battlefields that have entered Marine Corps lore, they are connected to this heritage through their service and sacrifice to the ideals of the Marine Corps. Always faithful, simplified Ellis. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. A campaign as long and far-reaching as the Battle of the Atlantic could only be won through the military contributions of an alliance of freedom-loving nations. We have representatives from all of those nations here today. Our next presenter, representing the leader of this alliance, and indeed the senior partner in this campaign, will speak on their behalf. Please welcome Commander Derek Powles, Royal Navy, Deputy Naval Attaché, the British Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. Thank you for giving me the honour of speaking today on behalf of the Allies. Thank you to my fellow Canadian, Netherlands and naval attachés for educating me on their nation's part in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought in a theatre covering millions of square miles of ocean. It was one of the longest continuous military campaigns of World War II, raging for 2,075 days, from the day the World War II started on the 3rd of September 1939 to victory in Europe on the 8th of May 1945. It was a campaign based on blockades. The Allies blockading Germany, and Germany's subsequent counter-blockade of the United Kingdom. As an island nation, the United Kingdom was heavily dependent on imported goods, particularly from the USA, requiring more than 1 million tons of imported life and war-sustaining cargo per week to be able to continue to fight and survive. Despite their declared neutrality, the Netherlands was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany in May 1940. The Dutch merchant fleet, which at the time was one of the largest in the world, was critical to these efforts, joining other merchant ships sailing in convoys protected by Allied naval forces to minimise the risks from an attack by German U-boats and warships. As we've already heard, Churchill wrote in his memoirs that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Over the course of 5 years, the situation changed constantly, with the Allies finally turning the tide in May 1943 with an increase in Allied resources and shipping due to the US industrial war machine, combined with the convergence of new technologies, better intelligence, including from Dutch resistance fighters, leading to improved effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine warfare and tactics. But as you'd expect from a no-fail mission, victory was achieved at a huge cost. Between 1939 and 1945, 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 Allied warships, including 24 Canadian ships, and some 72,000 Allied naval and merchant seamen lost their lives. In September 2021, I had the honour to attend the American Merchant Mariners Veterans Association annual conference and to speak to several surviving veterans and to hear their stories of bravery and sacrifice in the Atlantic convoys and the Arctic convoys, which are too often overlooked, but are ultimately critical to the success of any war effort. The announcement of the award in May 2022 of the Congressional Gold Medal to US merchant mariners for heroism in shipping supplies to the Allies, while often sailing defenceless against German submarines patrolling the Atlantic, is worthy recognition for what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the most difficult and dangerous transportation job ever undertaken. While the wounds of these battles have long since healed, and our once enemies have matured to become each other's trusted friends and allies, as we approach a time when and the number of World War II survivors remaining alive are diminishing, it is a reminder that no matter the length of time, the sacrifice and stories of these men and women on both sides must not be forgotten. As the world becomes more dangerous and unpredictable, as there is once again warring on the European continent, and the supply of equipment across the Atlantic again becomes vital, the need to keep the global sea lines of communications open and undersea critical infrastructure protected, the demands on all our navies to maintain operational advantage in the North Atlantic, like then, remains pivotal to our shared security and freedom. Then, as today, allies and partnerships will prove the decisive advantage. So as we reflect and give thanks for the sacrifice of those that gave their yesterdays for our better tomorrow, we also give thanks to all those that serve in all the maritime services, our veterans, and for the enduring alliances, partnerships and friendships that we hold so dear, and which continue to ensure our freedom and prosperity today. On behalf of the Allies, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commander. We'll continue with another story presented by Seaman Hannah Gibson, U.S. Navy.
Good evening, everyone. In many cases, we have very little information about the service members whose names are etched on these walls, but we can still remember their stories. We know little about Edwin Joseph Schneider's early life. He was from Brooklyn, and he married his wife Carol before joining the Navy in World War II. Edwin served as a radioman 3rd class and was assigned to the USS Eagle 56, a World War I era patrol boat that was deployed for rescue and training operations off the North Atlantic coast. On April 23, 1945, just off of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, the Eagle exploded amidships and broke in two. Only 13 of its 62 crew members survived to be rescued, although several survivors insisted that they'd seen a sail of a submarine bearing red and yellow markings. The sinking was classified as a boiler explosion. In 2001, for the first time in its history, the Navy reversed its findings of its own board of inquiry. The sinking of the Eagle was reclassified as a German submarine attack. The U-boat U-853 was confirmed to be operating in the area at the time. Its markings were of a red horse on a yellow shield. Edwin and other men lost in the sinking were posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. In 2018, divers reached the wreckage of the Eagle and discovered that its boilers were still intact, confirming the submarine attack. 2 weeks after sinking the Eagle, the U-835 sank the Black Point, a merchant ship, before being hunted down and herself sunk by U.S. Navy destroyers off the coast of Rhode Island. The next day, Germany surrendered, ending the war in the Atlantic. Thus, Edwin lost his life on the last warship sunk in U.S. waters, to the last submarine sunk in U.S. waters. Remember his service and honor his sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you, Seaman Gibson. And now we would like to invite you to take a step back to those wartime years with a popular song from the era that captures the sense of longing and distance felt by those who served and those who awaited them at home. Performing I'll Be Seeing You, please welcome Ms. Linnell Johnson of the Downtown Dames.
Cathedral bells were tolling, and our hearts sang on. Was it the spell of Paris or the April dawn? Who knows if we shall meet again? But when the morning chimes ring sweet again, this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut tree, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing tree, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
Thank you, Linnell, for that trip back to the 1940s. And just on a personal note, Linnell and I have been running around doing veterans things in New York City since we were in our 20s, so it's nice to reconnect and do these kinds of things again. So, it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. A few years ago, I was speaking with a friend, and we realized there was no Fleet Week remembrance here at this memorial. So we organized the first They Turned the Tide ceremony back in 2018. That friend was a Rear Admiral lower half in the reserves at the time. Today, he is the commanding officer of the Navy's Reserve Component. His support of this event and what it stands for is in keeping with the highest traditions of not only the Navy, but of his family, whose service dates back well over a century. Today, the USS Mustin, a guided missile destroyer named for that legacy of service, is on the front lines of keeping the world's sea lanes free and safe, filling a role similar in many ways to those tin can destroyers that were so vital to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Vice Admiral John Mustin, U.S. Navy Chief of Navy Reserves. John?
A lot of effort went into fixing this. It's complicated my life a little bit. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished visitors, thank you for the gracious introduction and the kind words. Mostly thank you to our allies and partners for joining us in this momentous occasion. And thank you particularly to Mr. Ryan Haig of the United War Veterans Council, as well as to the many contributors responsible for today's ceremony. And the one thing I've learned over 3 decades of service is that it takes a great degree of effort to create an event like this that appears effortless. So I'm honored to represent the United States Navy and to join such a diverse, distinguished team here today. The front 2 rows here are eye-wateringly important in terms of the representation to both our partnership and our alliances. And while today distance may separate us, but our common interests in the Atlantic Ocean bind us as enduring partner nations. Today, our fleets freely and jointly navigate the Atlantic, demonstrating the power of our connection and to each other as allies in pursuit of freedom. As valued partners, we're ready now and ready always to promote peace and stability, to deter threats, and to preserve freedom of navigation upon the open seas, precisely as we did together during World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic, as you've heard, has been called the longest, largest, and most complex naval battle in history. While Allied tactics evolved over time and our intelligence and weapons systems improved during the conflict, the battle was won by the collective contribution of our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, all from Atlantic Allied nations. Those brave souls from the greatest generation refused to yield to the threat. They refused to seek refuge in time of strife, and as you see before you, in many cases, too many in fact, made the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of victory. Their names are emblazoned on the monument slabs before us all. The Battle of the Atlantic between 1939 and 1945, the longest continuous military campaign in World War II, is where the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and Allied merchant convoys fought against the German submarine, air, and surface forces. The convoys, crucial to British and Soviet war efforts, later supported the expansion and the sustainment of U.S. forces in the European theater. Victory came at a cost, however. 72,200 Allied naval and merchant seamen gave their lives, and 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 Allied warships were sunk. Staggering numbers that today's generation cannot even fathom. Today, we commemorate those whose selfless dedication contributed to the triumph of tyranny, or to the triumph of freedom over tyranny. Those whose service turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, and frankly, of the war. This legacy resonates more so now than at any point in recent history, as rising competition on the seas echoes of past aggression. Today, just as they did 8 decades ago, the men and women of our great nation and our great partnerships and our allies step forward bravely in defense of freedom. The sailors of our respective navies and merchant fleets remain our asymmetric advantage. They are our special sauce. They are the accelerants that create the exponential lift in warfighting capability and sustainability, and they are the bridge of our respective continents. We have much to be proud of, and yet our work is far from done. Despite the challenges before us, I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic because we value the international norms, the partnerships, and the pioneering, innovative spirit that fuels our servicemen and women every single day. I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you on this important occasion at this important location, to celebrate our common history and appreciate the legacy that we all inherited, to commemorate those whose names are forever etched in this solemn monument. Heroes from every nation represented here today who gave their lives to protect freedom, to protect liberty, and to protect our way of life. Most importantly, I'm grateful to celebrate the enduring commitment to one another and to maintaining freedom in the Atlantic and around the world. May God bless you all, may God bless our great navies, and may God continue to bless our great nations. Thank you all.
Thank you, Admiral Mustin, for once again making a point of being here for this special event. Our final story from these walls may be familiar to some members of the audience. Like the story of Warren D. Amper, it involves the sinking of the troop transport Dorchester. It is presented today by Lieutenant Colonel James Hendon, Commissioner of New York City's Department of Veteran Services. Commissioner?
On February 3rd, 1943, the SS Dorchester, a troop transport, was slowly cruising through the icy waters of Torpedo Junction, a submarine-infested patch of the North Atlantic. Among the 900 men on board were 4 Army chaplains. George Lansing Fox, Methodist, a Pennsylvania-born World War I veteran and father of an enlisted Marine. Alexander Good, Jewish, born in Brooklyn, New York, and the son of a rabbi. Clark Vandersall Poling, Dutch Reformed Church. Born in Columbus, Ohio, his wife Betty was pregnant with their second child. John Patrick Washington, Roman Catholic, the son of Irish immigrants from Newark, New Jersey. These four chaplains have grown friendly through their shared commitment to their faiths and their concern for the men under their charge. Suddenly, the Dorchester was struck by a torpedo which exploded and plunged the ship into darkness. The vessel listed to its side and began to sink. Hundreds of men scrambled to escape the doomed ship. Its decks became a scene of frenzied chaos. Caught asleep, many men were missing life jackets. Lifeboats became overcrowded, causing them to break or to capsize. Some men clutched the railings, too paralyzed by fear to jump into the water below. Amidst the panic, the four chaplains moved about, calming and helping the men. They handed out spare life jackets and guided men towards the lifeboats. When the life jackets ran out, they gave away their own. When the last lifeboat had been launched, they stayed with the remaining men. They were last seen with their arms linked, praying together in English, Latin, and Hebrew as the ship went down. The story of the four chaplains became widely known at the time. A number of memorials were dedicated to their memory, but here at the East Coast Memorial, their names are listed with those of the men they served together in life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now we will lay the memorial wreaths. Would the wreath layers please proceed to the staging area to connect with their wreaths? As they move into place, please note that this portion of the ceremony will include the presentation of wreaths and then a benediction from the chaplain, followed by the chiming of 8 bells for the end of watch, and a rifle salute and taps. For those of you seated in the audience, we invite you to rise when the wreath laying begins. However, we do inform you that there are a large number of wreaths, and if you are unable to stand for more than a couple of minutes, we suggest that you rise at the end when the benediction begins. The wreath laying will be accompanied by a bagpiper from the Port Authority Police Department, John McGrath. Starting with the wreaths for our speakers and organizing partners. For the United War Veterans Council, Mark Otto, Executive Director, U.S. Marine Corps Veteran, and Jeff Swanson, Head of Operations, U.S. Navy Veteran. The United War Veterans Council honors and serves America's veterans. It is the organizer of the annual New York City Veterans Day Parade and serves veterans through its health and wellness programs and legacy education initiatives, such as today's event. For Wounded Warrior Project, Ms. Nancy Schillero, Senior Community Liaison, U.S. Marine Corps Veteran. A sponsor and co-organizer of today's activities, since 2003, Wounded Warrior Project has been meeting the growing needs of warriors and their caregivers. They are a proud partner of the United War Veterans Council. For ABMC, the American Battle Monuments Commission, Commissioner Raymond Kemp. The East Coast Memorial is under the stewardship of ABMC. Established by Congress in 1923, ABMC commemorates the service, achievements, and sacrifice of the U.S. Armed Forces. Continuing with wreaths for the U.S. military in official order of precedence. For the U.S. Army, Lieutenant Colonel James Hendon, Commissioner, New York City Department of Veteran Services. Nearly all of the over 4 million U.S. Army troops who served in the European theater safely crossed the Atlantic Ocean, thanks to the valiant efforts of the Allied Sea Services. Nearly 400 of those who were lost are listed on this memorial. For the Marines, Master Gunner John Escalante, U.S. Marine Corps. Marine Air Squadrons protected Allied shipping in the Caribbean. The 7 Marine Air Crew members who lost their lives are listed on these memorial walls. For the U.S. Navy, Vice Admiral John Muster, Chief of Navy Reserve. Navy ships and aircraft performed patrol and escort duties throughout the Atlantic. The names of nearly 3,000 U.S. Navy sailors and aviators who made the ultimate sacrifice are memorialized on these walls. For the U.S. Air Force, Captain Megan Morrissey and Master Sergeant Ashley Taylor. Army Air Corps airmen patrolled the eastern seaboard and were deployed overseas to Britain and Africa. Nearly 900 of their fallen comrades are remembered on these memorial walls. War and beyond. Coast Guard vessels and crewmen performed escort and rescue missions throughout the Battle of the Atlantic. Over 340 Coast Guardsmen memorialized here at this Coast Memorial. And now for our allies, starting with today's speakers. For France, Monsieur Benjamin Laban, Deputy Consul General of France in New York, and Premier Marshal Franck Leduc, French Navy, Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations. After the fall of France, nearly 100 French naval vessels escaped from Allied territory. They would continue to fight under the flag of the Free French Forces. Three French naval vessels served with the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the United Kingdom, Commander Derek Powers, Royal Navy, Deputy Naval Attaché, British Embassy. From the outbreak of war in September 1939 to Victory in Europe Day in May 1945, the British Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were engaged in operations on and over the Atlantic Ocean. An estimated 10,000 British sailors and nearly 6,000 air crew were lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. Continuing in alphabetical order are Allied nations. For Australia, Lieutenant Commander Amy Henson, Royal Australian Navy, Deputy Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of Australia to the UN. 7 Royal Australian Navy warships and 3 Royal Australian Air Force squadrons fought in the Battle of the Atlantic. In addition, many Australians served with the British Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Some 5,000 Australian service members received the Atlantic Star for the service in this campaign. For Belgium, Colonel Mark Rutte, Belgian Land Component, Military Advisor, and Adjutant Major Hans van Herbertling, Belgian Land Component, Assistant Military Advisor, both with the permanent representation of Belgium to the United Nations. The Belgian section of the British Royal Navy was crewed by exiles who had fled the Nazi occupation of their country. These included members of Belgium's merchant and fishing fleets, including some who had helped evacuate British forces from Dunkirk. For Brazil, Captain Leonardo Pavone, British Navy, Brazilian Navy, Deputy Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of Brazil to the United Nations. The Brazilian Navy and Air Force carried out patrol and escort duties in the South Atlantic, safely escorting over 600 convoys, consisting of over 3,000 merchant and troop ships. Brazil was also the only South American country to send troops overseas. The 26,000-man Brazilian Expeditionary Force crossed the Atlantic and served with distinction in the Mediterranean theater. For Canada, Captain Chris Dickinson, Royal Canadian Navy, Military Advisor, Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations. Some 200 Royal Navy warships and submarines fought in the Battle of the Atlantic, as did Dutch crew warplanes and Royal Air Force air bases and merchant aircraft carriers. For New Zealand, Captain David Fairweather, Royal New Zealand Navy Military and Police Advisor, New Zealand Permanent Mission to the UN. In the Battle of the Atlantic, thousands of New Zealanders served in the British Royal Navy and in the newly independent Royal New Zealand Navy. Hundreds also served in the British Royal Air Force and in two Royal New Zealand Air Force squadrons under the RAF Coastal Command. For Norway, Councillor Jannicke Behan Carlsen, Norwegian Armed Forces Legal Branch, Family Artillery Branch, Deputy Military Advisor, Permanent Mission Norway to the UN. In June 1940, 14 warships and 5 aircraft of the Royal Norwegian Navy followed the government in exile to Britain. Throughout the war, nearly 120 warships served under the Norwegian flag, many in the Battle of the Atlantic. In addition, the Norwegian aviators protected Allied sea lanes and bases in Scotland and Iceland. For Poland, Colonel Krzysztof Stech, Polish Land Forces Senior Military Advisor, and Lieutenant Colonel Lee Atuszewski, Polish Land Forces Military Advisor, both to the permanent mission of the Republic of Poland to the UN. In September 1939, the Polish Navy's Destroyer Division relocated to British ports to fight alongside the Royal Navy. These vessels served in the Battle of the Atlantic, along with leased British warship manned by Polish crew under the Polish flag, and Polish Air Force squadrons with the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command. Delivering today's benediction, Captain Warwick Fuller, Chaplain, U.S. Military Garrison at Fort Hamilton.
Let's pray with me. God of love and liberty, we bring our thanks this day for the peace and security we enjoy, which was won for us through the courage and devotion of those who gave their lives in time of war. We pray that their labor and sacrifice may not be in vain, but that their spirit may live on in us and in generations to come, that the liberty, truth, and justice which they sought to preserve may be seen and known in all the nations upon earth. And we commend to your gracious care in keeping all the men and women of our armed forces at home and abroad. Defend them day by day with your heavenly grace. Strengthen them in their trials and temptations. Give them courage to face the perils which beset them, and grant them a sense of your abiding presence wherever they may be, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you to the Coast Guard cutter Warren D. Ampert for the end-up watch bells, the Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 25th Marine Regiment for the rifle salute, and again to Flotilla Staff Officer Louis DeLeo of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary for playing taps. Once again, we thank all of our speakers, readers, and representatives, and attendees. Before we depart with the speakers, readers, and wreath layers, please meet up front for some group photos. And with that, we conclude this evening's ceremony. We thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a meaningful and enjoyable upcoming Memorial Day weekend. Thank you.